I'm your host, Dr. Symeon Rodger, and today I am delighted to have with us none other than Lama Tantrapa, one of the most recognizable figures in the Qigong world. A little bit about Lama Tantrapa. He is the lineage holder for Qi Dao, the Qi Dao that has been fostered in his clan for 27 generations. That's hard to beat. He has over 40 years of experience in this unique style of Tibetan Shamanic Qigong. He received most of his training from his grandfather, who was the Qi Dao Grand Master, and after being ordained as a Tibetan Bun Lama and receiving religious asylum in the United States, he founded the Academy of Qi Dao, dedicated to the continuation of his lineage. It also became the first and only school in the world offering professional certification in Qigong coaching, the profession Lama pioneered by integrating ancient energy arts of Tai Chi and Qigong with the modern modalities of peak performance and life coaching. His coaching has empowered thousands of martial artists, athletes, dancers, singers, writers, and actors to learn how to be in the flow at will. Welcome, Lama.
Thank you so much for having me here, Symeon. It's a pleasure to share whatever I have to share.
Well, I guess we've kind of answered the first question, which is usually, how did you get into this? Obviously, you wouldn't have continued in this for 40 years if there wasn't something drawing you into it and keeping you fully engaged. So what is it really that has you enamored, for lack of a better word, with Tai Chi and Qigong?
Well, you may be familiar with the Japanese term ikigai. And ikigai in Japanese refers to the principle of living your life's purpose. And the idea is that there are four major quadrants that we want to attend to. And that is what it is that we love doing, what it is that we're good at, what it is that people would pay money for, and what is it that would make the world a better place. If you find something that fits all four requirements, something that you love doing, that you would do even if you don't get paid for doing it, basically like a hobby, something that you are good at, in other words, you are feeling like you're mastering something and you're getting better and better at it, something that people will actually need from you, that you can satisfy their needs and perhaps they will pay you for that, and also something that makes the world a better place and satisfies the requirement for living a life that has a profound meaning. Well, that is exactly what I found in my art of Qi Dao. I was lucky enough, or maybe it's the matter of karma, to be born in a family where Qi Dao was practiced, and my grandfather found me a good enough student. On occasions, I was not a great student. On occasions, I was a quick study, but basically, he taught me from a relatively young age of 6. And then also sent me to study with some of the other masters. And I also continued exploring other disciplines, ranging from meditation and dream yoga to various styles of Buddhism and other forms of spirituality, as well as healing arts, martial arts, and you name it. And so combining all those things and comparing them to each other and to what I learned from my grandfather basically kept me busy for many, many years. And as a matter of fact, I also managed to find a way to make a living doing it. Although I'm ordained as a Tibetan Lama, I don't live in a monastery. So living a householder lifestyle actually requires being able to make a living somehow. Well, luckily enough, I found a way to do it. And I accomplished that by doing exactly what I love doing, and which I'm also pretty good at. So basically, that's the reason why I practice Tai Chi and Qigong. Mostly Qigong these days, much less Tai Chi, but I still practice Tai Chi push hands when I have an opportunity or when push comes to shove.
When push comes to shove. So you're really very blessed to have found what you love to do, and as you say, be paid for it. So you've really satisfied all these four requirements. There aren't a lot of people who can say that, I would imagine. For the benefit of our listeners, and quite frankly, for my own. You talk about Qi Dao, which is of course a very unique lineage. Now, I don't pretend to know a whole lot about Qi Dao. How would you characterize it?
I will characterize it in two ways. First, a pedestrian way. In other words, the way that I briefly explain it to people who are completely unfamiliar with it, I ask them, have you heard of Kung Fu? Of course, everybody nods their heads. Yes. Bruce Lee, Kung Fu TV series in the 70s. Yes, I've heard of Kung Fu. Great. Have you heard of yoga? Ooh, who hasn't heard of yoga, right? I said, okay, now imagine that those two hooked up and had a baby. And this baby inherited the best qualities of both of the parents. As in yoga, this baby has the ability to develop energy awareness, alignment of the body, greater flexibility, and spiritual awareness. And as that becomes possible, it also doesn't require sitting and holding silly poses till cows come home. As in Kung Fu, we also learn how to develop gracefulness, precision, and power in movement, the ability to kick ass or to protect ourselves and others. But we do that in a very mindful and elegant way by developing harmonious culture of movement. And that basically is how I explain Qi Dao in a relatively layman's terms, so to speak.
Well, it's understandable since most people,
it's easy to grok.
yeah, most people do not know what Qigong is, right? So,
that's why I don't go into the explanation of what Qigong is, because it often goes over people's heads, especially when you try to explain why it's spelled this way. Don't ask me why the Chinese spell Qigong, Qi with a QI. However, a more profound way of looking at it is that it's a system of self-realization that goes back to the shamanic roots of the energy arts. So if we're talking about Qigong, it has history of 5,000 or even 6,000 years. About 2,500 years ago, Buddha Shakyamuni, the founder of Buddhism, lived in India. At the same time, both Confucius and Lao Tzu lived in China, more or less simultaneously, almost. So the followers of Buddha, called Buddhists, basically developed the system of energy arts called Buddhist Qigong that's dedicated to attainment of enlightenment or nirvana or experiencing freedom from suffering. Great. The followers of Lao Tzu, the founder of Taoism, the perhaps legendary founder of Taoism, developed Taoist Qigong. So they pursue their own set of ideas and they practice for the purpose of attainment of immortality, or at least longevity, and perhaps being able to be in a flow with the Tao. Confucianists, the followers of the teachings of Confucius, developed their own style, Confucianist Qigong, that's dedicated to creating harmony in society and families and living your life with a meaning. Now, not as popular in America, I guess everybody already knows how to live a meaningful life in this country. The other aspects of Qigong are also very important. There is martial arts Qigong. For example, most people are familiar, at least heard of, the Shaolin monks. They practice Buddhism, but they actually practice martial arts as well. Shaolin Temple is purportedly the birthplace of many styles of Kung Fu in China. Now, the energy arts practiced by martial artists of that caliber are dedicated to ability to protect oneself and others, as well as personal empowerment and ability to live life with confidence and a sense of strength. And of course, there is also medical, or as I prefer to call it, therapeutic Qigong. That's, as name implies, dedicated to healing or prevention of illnesses. And lastly, there is also this sixth branch of Qigong, which very few people know about in America, and probably in Canada too, and that is Tantric Qigong, which follows the teachings of Tantra. Tantra and Tantric Buddhism are prevalent, particularly in Tibet. And so I'm much more familiar with that aspect of energy arts dedicated to creating mutually empowering and enlightening relationships. Hence my spiritual name, Tantrapa. Now, what we do is we actually realize all of these branches of the Qigong tree lead to the fruits on the tips of the branches. And most people just follow one branch or another branch. If you're a practitioner of medical Qigong, well, that's what you're going to be doing. You're going to be practicing medical Qigong. You're not going to concern yourself with other aspects. Sometimes medical Qigong practitioners are also Taoists, for example. Fine, they may combine the two. As I mentioned, Shaolin monks combine martial arts practice, but they also do Buddhist Qigong as well. So they initially combine Buddhist and martial arts Qigong practices too. There are other combinations of two, sometimes maybe three of these branches that can be found in some schools, but no school that I know of, other than Qidao, integrates them in a seamless manner by realizing, well, wait a moment. What did people do before 2,500 years ago, before Buddha Shakyamuni, before Lao Tzu or Confucius lived in China? Qigong has been around for at least 2,500 more years before that, if not longer. Well, they were practicing some kind of Qigong. What was that? Well, basically, that was shamanic Qigong, because shamanism is the oldest form of spirituality known to humankind. As far as I know, that was the practice that people were doing. They were basically practicing shamanic Qigong, and depending on different localities, they were practicing maybe Chinese shamanic Qigong, maybe Tibetan Shamanic Qigong, maybe Korean Shamanic Qigong. There are different styles. I practice and teach Tibetan Shamanic Qigong, and I call it Qidao for a simple reason. In Tibetan, it is named Truhor. Doesn't sound really good to an English-speaking ear, so I use the Chinese or Mandarin way of spelling and pronouncing it, which is Qidao. Means the same thing, the path of energy.
Okay, well, it's obvious to anyone that you are not Tibetan from an ethnic point of view, and I know you have a really interesting history when it comes to sort of where you were located when you learned this, and that might be instructive too for people to hear a little bit about.
Certainly. Well, Tibetan shamanism is also relatively close to Mongolian shamanism, because Mongolian and Tibetan cultures are quite similar. And at some point, it actually became the state religion of the Mongol Empire before they converted into Tibetan Buddhism. And Mongol Empire, starting with Genghis Khan, conquered most of the continent of Eurasia.
Yeah.
That was at some point the largest land empire in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Different parts of it, of course, eventually splintered, as most empires do. They fell apart. And some parts of it remained practicing either Tibetan Buddhism or Tibetan shamanism, or both. And believe it or not, even some parts of modern-day Russia are actually Buddhist countries, such as Kalmykia in the European part of Russia, just north of the Caucasian Mountains, Altai region, and it's kind of on a corner of Kazakhstan, China, Mongolia, and Russia, and Transbaikalia, or Buryatia, and that's east of the Baikal Lake. And my family originally came from the Altai region. That's where they've been taught, and they've continued practicing Tibetan practices of Truhor, or Tibetan Shamanic Qigong. And my parents ended up living in Ukraine, where I was born and raised. And so despite the fact that I'm half Russian and half Ukrainian, I ended up basically living at least the first half of my life in Ukraine, and some part of it in Russia, and also ended up serving in the Soviet military in various places. But second half of my life, I've been living mostly in the United States because I received asylum in the United States as the first Tibetan Lama from Ukraine who actually received asylum in this country.
I imagine there are not a lot of Tibetan lamas from Ukraine seeking
That was
political
pretty
asylum
funny
anywhere,
because
so I'm not surprised.
that was pretty funny because you're right, there aren't too many Tibetan Lamas to begin with. And when I applied for religious asylum in the US in 1995, they were actually quite standoffish about this idea of granting me asylum. They said, there is no precedent. We don't want to create a precedent of giving an asylum to a Tibetan Lama from Ukraine. I said, do you think that there is like a herd of Tibetan Lamas sitting on the border of Ukraine waiting to get out? So finally, they got, maybe not my joke, but they did a lot of investigation of what was going on, and I ended up receiving asylum in the US, where I live now.
Okay, that's an amazing backstory, and of course, it's totally unique. And thank you for giving us a little bit of background into Qi Dao. What is it from your students' point of view? What do you think it is that really attracts them to specifically what you do and perhaps your method of approaching this?
Well, the way I approach the energy arts is quite different from the way that most Qigong teachers do that. And when people think of Qigong, most people first conjure up the idea of doing some forms. Well, that's what most people equate with the practice of Qigong, but that's not what I do. I don't teach any forms. I don't practice any forms. I don't find them helpful. As a matter of fact, I most of the time consider them detrimental to one's practice. Of course, a lot of Qigong teachers and practitioners freak out when they hear that. They're like, well, that's all there is to Qigong. I'm like, no, there isn't. There is a lot more. I jokingly say, look, forms, it's like a poem in a foreign language. If you learn the poem and recite it by heart day in and day out, you may even put it to music and sing it. You can even dance to it and do some performances. Is that going to make you fluent in that language? No, it's not. You're just going to be singing or reciting a piece of poetry. What will make you fluent in the foreign language, which is basically what Qigong is for most people living in the West? Well, you need to start with learning the alphabet. What's the alphabet of this language? Well, these are the principles that underlie all these practices and forms. How many people teach the principles of Qigong? Very few.
Very few.
So the way I put it is that most students don't become masterful, and it's not their fault. It's actually what they've been taught. Not to master things, but just to copy somebody else's moves. Monkey see, monkey do. If you study with a master who tells you, you just do what I teach you, and the closer to my way of doing things your practice is, the better a student you consider to be. I will be giving you more advanced teachings and supporting you as my student. Maybe you will even become my disciple. I don't do that. Instead, I actually help people become masters. What tells the master apart from a regular teacher or a regular student? Well, those are, generally speaking, people who created new styles or new forms or new schools of Qigong. Why did they create new schools or create new styles or forms? Were the old ones no good? They actually violated exactly what they were taught by their teachers or by their masters. They were told, do this and you'll be golden. And at some point, they actually became renegades or mavericks. They did exactly opposite of what they were taught to do. They started experimenting or trying new things or combining things that they learned from elsewhere. In other words, they were actually doing the opposite of what everyone teaches. And nobody teaches how to do that except for me. So that basically makes me often feel like I picked up right where Bruce Lee left off, but not in the context of martial arts, but in the context of energy arts.
I was going to say very similar in that sense, in the sense of wanting to go back to principles, looking for what actually works, realizing that much of what passes for martial arts in Bruce Lee's case was formalism and wasn't working. And then, starting his own approach, which some people, unfortunately, later on would harden into its own style, violating Bruce Lee's own principles, but that's a whole other issue.
Well, luckily enough, I didn't have to create a new style, nor would creating a new style violate the principles, because the principles of Qigong are not against new styles. They are against practicing dead art. Basically, if the art is supposed to be preserved in precisely the same way that was done by previous generation of practitioners, that's not a living art. It's a dead art. We want to practice living art, where we can integrate life and art seamlessly, so that we infuse our life with the power that we get from our practice. And we bring the life into our practice so it is alive. Now, that's the reason why people come to study with me, is because they appreciate this. And they also—
That's also a very interesting concept, the whole idea that, if I understand you correctly too, that life itself becomes an art.
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, we talk a lot in our practices and in our explorations. I don't even call them exercises or forms. I call them explorations, because they're open-ended, and each and every time you're welcome to reinvent the wheel. It may be something that other practitioners discovered for themselves a long time ago, but that's okay that you're reinventing the wheel, because you'll never forget how the wheel works, which means you'll be able to integrate, assimilate this knowledge. That becomes wisdom. Just keeping data in your mind doesn't make you wise. You need to assimilate, integrate it, and make it yours. And that is basically what we study. And we also learn how to develop this attitude, not only to the practice of Qigong, but to anything that happens in our lives. So basically, we learn how to live in the flow of things, the Tao. Taoists would kill for that. That's the secret that I never kept closed. It's an open secret. This is how we practice how to be in the flow. We learn how to do that by testing, reading the feedback, and aligning ourselves in such a way that we're not pushing against the flow. We actually navigate the flow using the power much greater than our personal power to animate us through our life, even in the smallest steps that we take.
That's really incredible. And it's, it reminds me of the fact that, and perhaps you've encountered the same thing, whenever, for myself, I can say whenever I would go to teach someone a form, whether it's a Qigong form or a Tai Chi form, what I find is they're immediately wanting to visually observe what's happening and copy it as closely as possible. And as a first step, okay, that's understandable. If you're giving someone a framework, but then having to say to them, look, you've really got to get back into your own body. You really have to stop trying to look at it and copy and feel what's going on. And I get the impression you're trying to say much the same thing, something like that. You really have to experiment, and you can only do it by getting into yourself.
Absolutely. And also, we have certain framework for the experimentation, so it's not done willy-nilly. It's not just done at the spur of a moment. We feel like testing something. There is actually a reason to this madness. In other words, we have a method of learning first the letters of this alphabet. So each and every letter is basically a principle. There are various principles of orientation, principles of stabilization, principles of rooting, principles of grounding, principles of centering. They're not the same, by the way. The principles of streamlining, the principles of footwork, alignment, all kinds of interesting things. We do a lot of work with our feet, with our legs, which a lot of Qigong styles are kind of missing on. They tend to focus mostly on the upper limbs for some reason. And even in Tai Chi, 90% of Tai Chi practice basically focuses on what the arm is doing, but the power and gracefulness actually comes from the legs. You don't have to do much with the arms if your legs are doing the right thing.
Yes.
Basically, they get you to the right place at the right time. Then you can do the right thing when you're there. But if you don't know how to get to the right place at the right time, just moving across the terrain using your feet, then doing whatever you try to do with your arms is not going to matter. Now, what we do is we learn how to not only develop awareness of these principles, but then we also learn how to combine them. Because it's not enough to just know the alphabet. You need to figure out how to create words out of those letters. And some combinations make sense. There are actual words like that. Some combinations don't make sense. So we learn how to test to make sure that we are doing something that is meaningful and effective. That testing, again, is something that is so foreign to most Qigong practitioners and even practitioners of Tai Chi and many other similar disciplines. How many people test things? How many people in yoga test yoga things, or in Pilates test Pilates things, or meditation test meditation teachings? Not very many, if any. What we do is we don't take anything on face value. We want to experiment to find out what really works and what doesn't work, because it's another principle of authenticity. Now, authenticity is not a high priority value in Chinese culture and many other Asian cultures, and so it's not appreciated and taught. Well, obviously, that's one of the reasons why authenticity is not really to be seen in most practices that you see in Qigong field.
And yet it's kind of a fundamental principle of Buddhism itself, where Shakyamuni himself said something to the effect, don't believe me, test everything.
Absolutely. That's precisely my approach. We test everything. We don't take anything on faith. We develop faith based on the feedback that we receive. That basically we develop trust in something that we're capable of experiencing if we understand why things work and how to make it work. Another thing that also happens is that once we develop the ability to combine these principles into words, so to speak, we develop vocabulary. Now, this vocabulary may look like certain moves. So, for example, if we're talking about Tai Chi, we can say, well, this may be cloud hands. But my cloud hands are not going to look the same way as the cloud hands of 99.9% of Tai Chi practitioners. For example, if we're talking about forward push, most people in Tai Chi circles would call it brush the knee. Brush the knee is actual total misnomer because it's a secondary movement, knee brushing.
Yes.
Primary movement is associated with movement of the opposite hand that's moving forward. By definition, the primary movement is where the center of mass is moving. So if my center of mass is moving forward because I'm stepping forward, well, the forward push will be primary movement. So we don't concern ourselves too much with the knee brushing because we don't want to even practice blocks, which some people think, oh, this brush the knee is actually a block. Block against what? Against the kick? Well, legs are always stronger than arms. Don't bother with using arms against legs. Use legs against legs if you need to. But most importantly, we learn how to not block the movements coming at us because we just perceive them all as energy events. Somebody's kicking me, it's an energy event. It's the expression of certain small facet of the universal energy flow. This person who's trying to punch me is actually one of the many facets of the universe. And there's an energy being projected at me. Well, so instead of standing there like a dummy and trying to block things, I would much rather get out of harm's way. Now, that's much more graceful and safe. And at the same time, it also allows me to do whatever else I want to do with my arms and other limbs, basically, that is much more effective and at the same time, much more graceful way of dealing with conflict. For example, repulse the monkey. Well, it's another really great example of a movement where secondary movement actually gave the name to the whole move. Because this movement has just as much about monkeys as about repulsing. It's basically, this is a secondary movement. The primary movement is backward pull because the center mass is moving backwards. You're stepping in that direction. Well, so we basically reverse engineer all of these practices, all of these moves. And we want to understand what principles govern these movements, how to make them work, practice them till we become really proficient at them, and integrate them into communication. So not enough to just build a vocabulary, we also need to understand the syntax and a way to form sentences in this foreign language. And then we can actually communicate. And we develop communication skills by doing more and more of that. So this step-by-step, simple but elegant approach allows people who study with me to become extremely proficient in a relatively short amount of time. Now,
well, that's another heresy. Another heresy saying that you can do it in a short amount of time.
Well, life is short.
But exactly. Yeah.
Who wants to study 10 years with, like just yesterday, I was talking to one of the prospect students, and he said, one master who teaches energy arts told me I need to study with him for 10 years. Then he will consider advancing me to a more advanced level of training and receiving certification. Well, that, of course, makes me smile, first of all, because he's 75 years of age right now. So by the time he gets 85, maybe he will not even be interested in getting certification as a Qigong teacher. But most importantly, he has already been practicing for years. Let's just refine his understanding. And if he is capable of integrating some of these ideas and principles successfully, he doesn't have to study with me for 10 years. I'll be happy to certify him in a year or two or less. As a matter of fact, I have certification programs that take 6 months. Why? Because they're not top level certification programs. It's like, green belt or some lower belt in martial arts. It's a certification of sorts. You need to feel like you're progressing along the path. And that certification does allow you to become a Qidao practitioner. It's just the basic Qidao practitioner certification. So that also is the step in the direction of more intermediate or advanced levels of training and so
on. Okay, yeah. So what would you say is the main barrier you find for students, since most of your students, of course, will be ordinary North Americans, what do they run into that impedes their progress, or what qualities allow them to really progress and gain that level of mastery that you've talked about?
Misalignment of the values.
Values.
The values is something that we consider the most important to us in our lives. But how often do people talk about values? Not very often. We all are good in small talk. But this is not a small talk. It's actually talk about the most important things. Once I introduced this idea at one of the National Qigong Association conferences, some Qigong teachers came to me and said, "Why are you talking about values? We don't talk about this kind of things in Qigong." I said, "Well, maybe you don't. How often do people sign up for your programs or classes and then drop out?" They're like 50%, maybe 60, maybe 70 on occasion. Well, you know why? Because their values are not aligned with the practice. In other words, if their values felt like they're supported by the practice, and the practice is in great alignment with their value system, would they ever drop out? No, they would feel like this is exactly what allows me to uphold the most important things in my life. Not talking about values is basically what hampers the ability of the person to stick to the program, to follow a certain path, and to achieve mastery along the path. So I do talk about values with my students, maybe not from the very get-go, but as we become more and more familiar with each other, we start talking about things that are of a greater and greater profundity, if you will, or value. And so then I actually invite my students to do something that most people never do in their lives. And that is reevaluate their values. Because most values that people have are not really their own.
Mm-hmm.
They inherited them from their parents, grandparents, got indoctrinated by the media, by society, religion, and whatnot. In other words, no wonder that some of the things that they try to do are not in alignment with their values. They're trying to do one thing, but somewhere deep in their unconscious, there is a different value system that is not in cahoots, not in alignment. Well, that would undermine anyone's efforts. That's why people experience internal sabotage or too much internal conflict that they cannot make up their mind, or they procrastinate, or they just simply freeze and don't do anything. We have to rework our values, reprioritize them in such a way that they would become our own authentic values. Instead of pursuing somebody else's dreams and values, we learn how to manifest and live our own dreams. In order to achieve that, we obviously need to reevaluate which values actually serve us, and perhaps remove or downgrade some of the values that no longer serve us or are not as important to us anymore. And so this process isn't something that everyone is equally good at. Some people are more coachable than others. That's one of the reasons why I had to create the whole profession of Qigong coaching, because coaching is the process that allows people to go through this reevaluation of their values.
Well, that makes perfect sense, because it's much more than passing on certain physical movements and saying, just as you said, monkey see, monkey do what I do, you'll be golden. But it's much deeper than that. So definitely it's a coaching, would have to be a coaching process in the true sense of the word. How can the average person in North America, if they're looking to study Tai Chi Qigong, if they're looking to get into that, how can they differentiate a good place to be versus maybe not such a good place to be? How can they differentiate the qualities of their prospective teachers and that kind of thing?
That's tricky, because teachers often put up a nice facade. And it's not always easy to see the real person behind the facade. So not all viewers of our interview or listeners of it will be able to discern what is really behind the mask of the teacher. Now, we all have masks, don't take me wrong. It's not like Qigong masters and Qigong teachers and Tai Chi teachers are the only ones who wear masks. Everyone, as long as we have a personality, we have some kind of mask. The question is, what is behind the mask? In other words, how different is the face, the original face of the person from what appears to be? And that basically is how I look at different levels of teachers. You know, ordinary teachers teach techniques and forms. And the students basically don't go anywhere beyond this relatively superficial level of training. So I would always suggest finding not an ordinary, but an extraordinary teacher or a master. What separates the masters from the teachers of a lower caliber is that they don't just teach the tactics, they teach the strategies, who help the students understand why certain things are used under certain circumstances, how to perhaps adjust or apply certain mechanisms or teachings or techniques that they're learning. In other words, they capitalize on their strategic advantages. Now, that's what makes them a master. They're by definition, mastery is the ability to perform things that are difficult for most people with relative ease. Why do they do it? Because they capitalize on their strategic advantages. Now, the challenge with that is that different people have different advantages or different strengths and weaknesses. And so what works for one person, say a Qigong master, may not work equally well for others, perhaps the students. But if they're just trying to mimic the master in the way that he moves or performs some practices, they will be trying to fit themselves into that box. And only the great masters or grandmasters don't just teach the techniques or tactics, don't just teach the strategies with their associated strategic advantages, but actually teach the principles underlying all of these practices. What makes grandmasters is that they actually teach others to become masters, and they have masters among the students. That's basically what makes them grandmasters. Now, if you are lucky enough to find somebody like that, that is a great opportunity to learn at a deep level. Of course, there aren't that many grandmasters around, so you have to exercise discernment and see what you resonate with, because you may resonate with something that perhaps others don't. In other words, the sense of energy resonance is also a really important cornerstone of wisdom, because there is no wisdom without discernment, because it's the most intelligent way to make decisions. The way we develop discernment is on the basis of energy resonance. In other words, we learn how to not just decide upon certain preconceived ideas or stereotypes of thinking. We make decisions based on energy resonance, which is, again, one of the major principles that we study in Qigong. Those people who are familiar with that, perhaps they also learn it from other styles of Qigong or other energy disciplines, would know that applying that idea of resonance with a teacher, basically, how do you feel in the company of this person? It's like if you meet this person somewhere at the party. Would you want to hang out and talk to them? And if so, how would your body feel? Would you feel all cringing and tense? You won't be talking to a person who makes you cringe for more than just a few minutes or just a few seconds, maybe. But if you feel like you can spend a long time in the company of that person because there is rapport, well, that's an invitation to dig deeper and discover maybe there is something there that is worth exploring.
No, that makes perfect sense. And yet it's difficult to do, as you say, and masters can be rather few and far between. What would you say to someone who says that they, I'd really like to be able to advance in my Qigong or my Tai Chi to the point where I myself can be a teacher, and a good teacher at that. So what kind of advice would you give to people for that?
Practice makes perfect. The best way to learn at the deep level is by teaching whatever you're learning. So that's why one of the things that I always ask my students to do when they enroll in any of my programs is to find themselves a practice partner or several practice partners, and have at least one or several partners who would participate in some testing and maintain mutual accountability, and perhaps ask some questions, and just generally maintain certain sense of camaraderie, because that's another thing that helps us stay on the path. When we have some sense of camaraderie, we don't feel like we are weirdos doing something bizarre that nobody else understands and wants to do. Instead, we're practicing with someone who also resonates and appreciates our practices. We thrive much better together. Besides, as you are learning and sharing what you're learning with your practice partner, inadvertently, you are practicing Qigong coaching or Tai Chi coaching, which is also the disciplines that pioneered. And the idea of Tai Chi or Qigong coaching basically is that you're not just telling them, just follow my moves. If I move like this, you should move like this. Instead, we admit, I'm a student, I'm just learning this stuff. Most importantly, let's figure out how we can test things and what the principles are. And then we start putting these principles to good use, applying them to our practices so that these practices are informed by these principles rather than deformed by some misalignment or misunderstandings. That essentially, I think, is one of the best ways to become a good teacher, just practicing teaching. And the more you, and the sooner you transition from teaching to coaching, I think is the best. In other words, teaching is the practice of downloading information or certain techniques into the student's mind or their body. But coaching is the process of inviting another person to discover something for themselves that perhaps they didn't know before, or connect the dots between the cause and effect that they weren't aware of. And what does connecting the dots do? Well, basically makes you less ignorant as to the cause and effect connections. Well, if Buddha Shakyamuni was right, and I think he was, about the main cause of suffering, he said main cause of suffering is ignorance. The ignorance of what? Well, the ignorance of the law of karma, the cause and effect. So as we connect the dots, we become less ignorant. We actually are less likely to suffer. Who wouldn't want that? If we can experience it for ourselves and also help our practice partner or partners experience freedom from suffering, well, we're in nirvana together. That's how we create and build our communities.
Absolutely. And it's this process of discovering it for oneself, as you say, that really makes the difference. And because if you can't get past the formalism of a preconceived form that's been passed down for who knows how long, and which is allegedly unchanged since ancient times, even though it's completely mutated 100 times, it's very difficult, I think, to make progress. One of the things I tell people, I'm not sure if you'd agree, is that having a partner allows you to test certain things that you cannot do alone. You really can't test your alignment alone. That's very difficult to do. But when somebody else is exerting force on you, even gently in a collaborative way, you can begin to discern if this is actually working, that kind of thing.
I absolutely agree with what you said. Thank you so much, Symeon, for bringing that up. The only thing that I would add is, rather than force, let's learn how to apply power. What's the difference between using power versus using force? Well, simply put, if I'm standing here and I'm pushing somebody using the strength of my muscles,
yes,
using force. How do you use power? Well, it's actually simpler and easier than using force.
Much.
Simply place your hand or even elbow. I love using elbows because it eliminates the possibility of using triceps muscles to exert force. Just simply bring the elbow to touch the part of the body of the person you're testing, and then lift the front foot. Hopefully, ideally, it would be the opposite foot. So if I'm using the right arm to push with, my left foot is in front of me. It's like you walk down the street, right foot, left hand, right. It's transverse motion. And then you lift this foot up in the air for a second. The gravity will start pulling it forward because you eliminated support of your front foot in front of you. You will start falling forward, propelled by the G-force. G-force is reliable. It's not going to go away anytime soon. It's pretty consistent. And it allows us to experience much more objective results of testing because they're not subjective using the physical force. They use power. No effort other than lifting the foot up in the air required. Does it make sense? It actually is kind of a more intelligent way to test even than so-called muscle testing in applied kinesiology. You know, like when a person pushes the arm down, for example. Yeah, well, the muscles that are being tested essentially are deltoids in this case. There are other types of doing the muscle testing, but in this case, if the arm is being pushed down, there's always the question of whether the person who's doing the push is pushing at the same level of strength each and every time.
Right.
And what we do is we learn how to use gravity instead of strength. So we can trust it, we can duplicate it, and that gives us the objective results. That's basically why we want to do testing. We want to get some objectivity in the picture. And
That's really interesting, yeah.
And we also learn to test not just an isolated muscle, because the muscle will get tired, and after a few tests, it will actually start giving you erroneous results. Who wants that? We want to test the whole body.
Mm-hmm.
It's the entire system that we're testing, not just an isolated muscle. That gives us the ability to have much more intelligent and much more trustworthy testing protocols that also can be applied virtually anywhere. For example, in context of Tai Chi, well, you can test how stable a person is, for example, when they're standing like this, or when they're standing like that, or when they're moving, or when they're performing any kind of technique.
Mm-hmm.
How much power does the person have? Well, let's see. Is he actually using power? In Tai Chi, there is an axiom, use the whole body power.
Mm-hmm.
But nobody in Tai Chi actually uses whole body power. Like literally, not one Tai Chi practitioner I've ever met actually used whole body power. Why? Simple. They always step first and then push. Well, if you're stepping first, as soon as the foot landed on the ground, your kinetic energy drained into the ground through the stepping foot. Your center of mass stops moving forward or slows down, and that basically is the reason why everybody resorts to using force in the forward push. What if you push with the hand while the foot is still up in air?
Mm-hmm.
And you deliver impact into the target or project energy using whole body movement in that direction. And only then land on the ground as softly as possible so that you don't drain your kinetic energy into the ground through the foot, but you actually deliver it into your target. This is just
a very interesting perspective. It's almost, I would say, what I immediately thought of, what came to mind is that actually Xingyi is probably better at that than Tai Chi, although
yes.
where that would take us to a whole other discussion.
Yes, Xingyi definitely uses this type of footwork. So each of the internal styles and external styles have their own quirks and pros and cons. For example, yes. Tai Chi has much more circular culture movement as compared to Xingyi.
Mm-hmm.
Circular culture of movement is more harmonious than linear start-stop culture of movement. Why? Because it takes just as much energy to stop your movement as it takes to initiate the movement. And then if you're removing the arm and going back, you are again spending that much energy to move it back, and then stopping it again takes as much energy. In other words, you're spending 3 to 4 times as much energy as it actually takes to deliver impact. Well, that's very unwise way of energy expenditure. So Tai Chi actually, in this context, would allow you to have more circular and less start-stop way of moving. But the footwork is really deficient. And Xingyi obviously has something to add to the context in terms of the footwork. For example, Bagua, if I throw that in the mix, has wonderful ways of working with hands. And obviously, Bagua, as name implies, is the art of using palms, striking with the palms, not fists or karate chops. Why is it more beneficial, more effective, more energetically aligned? Lagong point, the energy gateway in the center of the palm. It's like a beam of energy coming perpendicular to the surface of the palm out of the Lagong point. So when you're pushing with the Lagong point, pointing in the direction of the target, you're aligning your energy with the primary movement. Now, when you're making a punch, whatever position of the punch of the fist is, pretty much always, by definition, the logon point is pointing at about 90 degrees angle in relation to the direction towards the target.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Same with karate chops. So that's why karate chops or even punches are never as strong as the strike with open palm if you bother to test, which we do all the time. And nobody's ever been able to deliver as great of a punch in our testing methods as compared to the open palm strike. Now, what we study first is not even open palm strikes. We study first how to use our elbows. As I mentioned, it just forces you to use power instead of force. Most people, when push comes to shove, default to the most basic things that they learned at the very basic level of their training. Well, if at the very basic level of your training, you learn how to make elbow strikes and knee kicks, kind of like in Muay Thai, if you will, you will never go wrong because you will be able to deal with almost anything with more efficacy and at the distance that most people are uncomfortable at.
Yes. And most martial artists are deeply uncomfortable with that distance.
Yeah, they try to grapple if you're at that distance, which means they tense up because even to grab, even to clench the fist already requires tension in the forearms. And of course, most people also tense up their muscles of arms and shoulders and chest, and the whole system becomes tense. Tension is not a sign of strength. So basically,
no, tension means tense here, tense here, tense here. I've got your center line, your balance. You've just given it to me on a platter.
Exactly.
I mean,
exactly. That's why I don't teach people how to grapple. I teach people how to use elbows and knees at a short distance. And then we extend the distance to greater distance from the opponent if we're talking about martial arts applications of Qigong, or if we're talking about therapeutic applications. Well, obviously, we're not going to be healing them a lot with our elbows. We learn how to project energy further down the arm to our hands. But it's a lot easier to learn how to project energy down the arm to the hand if your elbow knows how to receive this energy. If you don't know how to send the wave energy into the elbow, what's the likelihood of it making its way into the hand?
Mm-hmm.
Pretty much zero chance.
Yep.
That's exactly why we have this step-by-step from a simple to more complex approach. It's also a major principle of any didactics or educational process. But most people skip this. How many people in Qigong circles do you know who learn how to do elbow strikes? Maybe there are some, but not very many. Yeah.
In Qigong circles, I would say zero.
So you learn how to do exactly that because it's the missing link. And if we take care of the missing link, then everything else that goes from that point on becomes easy.
Mm-hmm.
If we don't take care of the missing link or we skip over it, other things become exceedingly difficult because we don't have a leg to stand on, so to speak. Now, it's just one of many, many examples of this way of teaching and coaching that we have in Academy of Qidao that is radically different from the way that most Qigong schools and schools of internal arts operate. As you can see, we can disassemble any internal art technique or external art technique to that matter, of course, and then apply principles to it, and then reassemble it again in a way that it reverse engineers it in a much more effective and much more useful manner, in such a way that it actually can work for you. Well, that basically what makes our practitioners much more masterful than majority of practitioners. That's why I honestly state that when people graduate from our advanced program, they are guaranteed to be at the top 1% of Qigong practitioners worldwide. And it doesn't take them more than a year or two to achieve that level of training with me. It's just doing that which works and quit doing that which doesn't work. Paraphrase briefly.
Another heresy. Yes. Just before we sign off here, for those who one might be interested at some point in becoming teachers, whether it's Tai Chi, Qigong of whatever version, and since you've been very successful yourself at this, what have been the best business practices that you've seen? I know it's more of a worldly question, so to speak, but I mean, if our business practices don't work, we're not able to continue to help people.
Well, one of the best business practices that I experienced myself and I share with my students is transitioning from teaching to coaching. Literally, we learn how to stop trying to download information into our students' brains and start coaching them. And it can start even before they sign up for their coaching programs or certification programs or any other type of programs with us. That's why, for example, I do Qigong coaching clinics. Every other Saturday, I do Qigong coaching clinic at 10 o'clock in the morning or 1 o'clock in the afternoon Eastern time, 10 o'clock Pacific time. We get together, not a lot of people, usually between 50 and 70 people, get together for exploring things, asking questions, sharing some things that perhaps people have to share, and learn whatever they need to learn. I don't even charge anything for those coaching clinics. But virtually every time I do a clinic like that, I end up with 1 or 2 new students or coaching clients who pay a few $1,000s for their programs or coachings. So that's a no-brainer. Another thing.
Are you doing this, just so people can clearly understand what you're saying, are you doing this online or live, or how does it?
I used to do it live. We used to have a meetup group, meetup.com.
Mm-hmm.
It's one of those social networks that actually gets people offline and invites them to meet face to face. Used to, at least before the pandemic. Our meetup group actually grew before the pandemic, was about 1,000 people strong, which was the largest meetup group dedicated to Qigong in the world. However, thanks to the pandemic, we had to stop doing face-to-face meetups and started doing them online. And thanks to the fact that I had been teaching online programs for a decade prior to the pandemic, I was very comfortable transitioning completely online. So I basically closed my dojo and do 99% of all our clinics virtually. Now, some people who make their way to Portland, Oregon, where I live, or they live here, they actually meet with me face to face. I still have a studio where we can meet and we can practice together, or we can combine practicing together with broadcasting live to our meetup online. So basically people can benefit from what we're experiencing face to face, for example, during some testing like we were just discussing.
Okay, no, that's really interesting to know that it's both about the transition from teaching to coaching and the percentage of things that you're doing online and are able to do online in such a physical discipline as this. So for everybody who is listening or watching, please feel free to visit qigongcoaching.com for more information about Lama Tantrapa certification programs for Qigong coaches and Tai Chi coaches, and to learn more about his enlightening programs and online courses, please go to academyofqidao.com, and we'll put those links in the descriptions. And please join me in thanking Lama Tantrapa for sharing all of this. So thank you again. And we are deeply grateful for everything you've been able to share.